Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Capperell, and I am the Director of Education and Outreach at the Asia Society Texas. Welcome to our program, Race in Asia, a Rice University Symposium, in partnership with Rice University's Chao Center for Asian Studies and Rice University's Center for Engaged Research and Collaborative Learning. In the wake of escalating violence against Asian American and Pacific Islander communities in the United States, there have been increased calls for community talk around race and racism. Correspondingly, increased interconnections between Asia and the world have prompted growing questions around how to approach new ethnic and national conflicts emerging in the region. Asia Society frequently highlights policy experts, professors, and business leaders speaking on the topics of race and racism. Today, we are excited to bring youth and student voice to the conversation. With that, allow me to introduce Dr. Alex Lee, an Annette and Hugh Gregg postdoctoral fellow in transnational Asian studies at Rice University's Chao Center for Asian Studies.
All right, thank you, Ms. Capperell, for that introduction. One moment, let me just share my screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see it. So yes, I wanted to give a quick introduction to the webcast and how it was developed, and also give some thanks to many of those who helped make this happen. As Ms. Capperell mentioned, my name is Alex Lee. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Chao Center for Asian Studies. Today's webcast is a culmination of a course I developed through the Chao Center called Race, Nation, and Empire in Modern Asia. And this is actually the students' final project. So I think they're quite amazing. The Chao Center has a focus on transnational, transhistoric, diasporic, and global movements of peoples and cultures of Greater Asia. And this course was trying to reflect that. So in this case, Asia, as the Chao Center's own Dr. Rich Smith would put it, thinking about Asia not just in terms of the territory, but Asia across borders. We are very fortunate to receive a course development grant from the Center for Engaged Research and Collaborative Learning. And their focus is on creating innovative programming meant to enhance attention and approaches to addressing the socio-cultural, historical, and political dimensions of life in Houston. And finally, the Asia Society Texas Center has been most generous in hosting this webcast. I wanted to take time to thank some individual folks to let you all know that this took a group effort to some extent. So at the Chao Center, Dr. Hejin Ko, who was instrumental in the development of this course, Professor Sonia Rong and Richard Smith, Hehun Matos, Amber Sinzik, and Professor Lisa Balabanlalar. At Circle, Maya Rain. At Asia Society, Jennifer Copper, Rebecca Becerra, and Alana Rubin. All of our amazing guests, of which there are many, Dr. Gordon Chang, Mana Hayakawa, Jenny Lee, Stephanie Santos, Ka-Kin Chuk, Maria Huang, Grace Tran, Kali Rubai, and Naveen Munai. And finally, of course, the students who worked very hard this semester, who endured an ongoing pandemic, a Texas crisis, the freeze, you might have heard about in the news. Excuse me. I think they're the real stars of this webcast. So a quick introduction for the students. As you can see, they all come from very different backgrounds, which I think is all the more impressive that for many of them, this is not necessarily their academic focus. And yet, as you will see, the quality of the presentations are great. So our first group will be Annie Chen, Adele Jia, and Victor Nguyen, who will be discussing beauty and anti-Blackness in Asia. That will be followed by another group, Sarah Ko and Daniel Lee, who will be discussing cultural appropriation in fashion in the US and in Asia. And then our final group will be Chi-Won Kim, Sarah Easley, and Peter Wong, who will be discussing racial solidarity. And it's worth noting that Hoang Nguyen, who is our one asynchronous student who's been working very hard in Vietnam, he's not with us today, but he is with us in spirit, and hopefully he's watching. Also worth noting is that these are all projects that the students themselves chose. These are their arguments, their methodologies. I helped guide them a bit, but this is very much student-led, which I think is also a great accomplishment. Finally, before I move on to our guest speakers, a quick introduction. Dr. David O is an associate professor of communication arts, media studies at Ramapo College of New Jersey. He brings a wealth of knowledge with work examining representations of Asian Americans in US media culture, Asian American mediated identities, transnational reception of Korean media, and othering in Korean media culture. And our other esteemed guest speaker is Dr. Neha Vora, who is an associate professor of anthropology in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at Lafayette College. Her research and teaching interests include migration, citizenship, higher education, South Asian and Muslim diasporas, gender, liberalism, political economy, and the state in the Arabian Peninsula region and in the United States. Unfortunately, because of scheduling, Professor O will have to leave a little early today. So if you have any questions for him, feel free to email him as I've noted there in the slide. I believe Dr. Vora will be able to stay, however. And so with that, I'm gonna move it to Professor O for our first guest talk.
All right, great. So thank you for the opportunity to come speak with all of you today. And also thank you to the students for preparing your presentation. I'm really looking forward to listening to the ones that I can. And it also caused me to reflect a little bit on research of my own and the ways in which I engage in research. And so I was thinking about how the projects that are the most meaningful to me are the ones in which I am just simply curious. Maybe I might want to challenge received wisdom a little bit, or in some cases because something has bothered me. And so this presentation is actually going to be about something that has bothered me a little bit. And so one thing that's bothered me is the translation of the Korean word 인종차별. And for those of you who don't speak Korean, 인종차별 usually gets translated as racism. And if we take apart the word, 인종 can refer to race, ethnicity, nationality, etc. And I guess if I were to provide a direct translation, I might say something like person category or category of people. And 차별 refers to discrimination. So I don't like the translation because I think that the translation is inaccurate. And I'm also kind of frustrated a little bit because I don't have a good word to use instead of racism instead. And so this project has been really about thinking through what other ways might I think about 인종차별 and othering in South Korea so that we can understand difference better. And so this kind of links to a decolonial impulse, not necessarily to reject Western frameworks, but to say when Western frameworks are inadequate in terms of providing an explanation, then it's important to turn to local knowledge. And so what I want to do with this presentation is at the end of the presentation, I want to provide a new concept, a new translation. And in the meantime, between now and then, I want to share two alternative explanations for othering in South Korea. One in which I'll spend the most time on is racism, and the other is ethnocentrism. So for arguments about racism, usually it's articulated as the belief that South Koreans have internalized white supremacy and also anti-Blackness. And we might turn to scholars like Catherine Moon, who have pointed out that with the US military's outsized role in South Korea following the end of World War II and arguably the occupation of the US in South Korea, that had led to the introduction of US racial hierarchies and racial thinking that had become widespread. Scholars such as Lee Min-ju, An Ji-hyun, also myself, have also argued that whiteness in South Korea occupies a privileged position. Han Gun-soo, a sociologist, argues that for Western residents, that they enjoy what he calls a denizen status. And what he means by this is that other than the most privileged Koreans, that white Western residents are comparatively the most advantaged. And some evidence for this might be that some scholars have pointed out that there are few demands for white residents to learn how to speak Korean, but instead that Koreans will accommodate their inability to speak Korean by speaking English with them. Of course, Nadia Kim has also pointed out that there is anti-Blackness in South Korea. And for those of you who are familiar with Korea at all, and I know that there's a student presentation on anti-Blackness in Asia, you've probably heard accounts of this, and you've probably heard of the ways in which white people might be advantaged, for example, in the market for English teachers or in the dating market and things like that. And you might have heard stories of the ways in which Black Americans or Black Africans are also mistreated in South Korea. And so what I'm going to do now is not necessarily argue against that, because I think that there's ample evidence that this is true, but rather to complicate this argument just a little bit, to say that unlike in the United States, racism and race doesn't have the same kinds of totalizing cultural logics that it does in South Korea. And so if we think about this for a moment, we might start to ask, so what would South Koreans gain by adopting white supremacy as a system in which to organize society? And I think that there wouldn't be a clear reason to want to do that. There's no clear incentive to want to do that. And if we look at the major sectors of society, education, government, politics, religion, media, we'll notice that there aren't white people in positions of leadership in these sectors of society as well. So we could argue that white people, while they're given symbolic capital in South Korea, that they lack structural power. And one other thing that you might hear from white residents in South Korea is that they'll often complain that they're treated like outsiders. And they'll use the Korean label 외국인, which means foreigner. And they would argue that this is a term that is derogatory. And I think from their experience, it would make sense because, all right, hopefully my internet is not too bad here. But anyway, I think that it would make sense because from their experience, while they may be privileged in some ways, that they are also treated as outsiders. They're treated as desirable for their foreignness and not desirable for their ability to assimilate or to acculturate into Koreanness. So the other major explanation is ethnocentrism. And ethnocentrism, we might argue, is something like a Korea first argument or a make Korea great again kind of argument. And so Aaron Chung and Daisy Kim and other scholars have argued that because of Korea's history as a colony of Japan, that because of its defensive nationalism, that developed a very strong monoethnicity myth, and that has created a kind of pervasive ethnocentrism in South Korea. And I think that this argument also has merit as well, but that it is also perhaps a partial argument. And I say that it's a partial argument because if we look at groups who are discriminated in South Korea, some of the groups who are the most strongly discriminated in terms of educational opportunity, socioeconomics, are people who are also ethnic Koreans. So for example, Korean Chinese are ethnic, so in Korea, they would be referred to as Chosunjok, but ethnic Koreans who are from China are strongly discriminated against. In media, they are probably the most widely represented as a criminal threat and as an underground threat. And another group that is discriminated against are North Korean refugees, who are argued to be kind of a blight on society, a drain on society because of their inability to adapt to a neoliberal capitalist structure. And then, of course, if we're talking about the previous argument, we would also notice that the denizen status of white Westerners also would kind of fly in the face of an ethnocentric argument. So to pull all of these together, I guess to conclude, I would say that racism as an explanation, ethnocentrism as an explanation are all partial explanations. There is certainly explanatory truth in those arguments, but that those don't fully explain how Koreans would understand difference. And so the concept that I want to share with you is really just a literal translation of 인종차별, and that word that I'm going to share. And I'm a little embarrassed to say it because it's kind of a clunky word. So I wish I could think of something a little bit more elegant, but the word is anthrocategorism. And I argue that anthrocategorism is a kind of othering that is both multidimensional and contextual. And in the limited amount of time that I have right now, I just want to kind of explain very briefly what I mean by multidimensional. And so as as Koreans think about difference, I would argue that difference is organized on at least two dimensions. One would be hierarchy of desirability and undesirability, and the other one would be a concentric notion of normality, so normal from the center extending outward. And so if we take an example like white Westerners or white Americans, we might see that white Americans might be considered high in terms of desirability, but that they would be considered far from norm, so that they would be considered foreign or an outsider. If we take Korean Americans, we might be lower on hierarchy in terms of desirability, but we would be closer to the center in terms of normality. Or if we take a group like Indonesians, they might be low on hierarchy, but also low in terms of normality, so far from the center, which would mean that they would be most strongly discriminated against. And so I don't know that I would argue that this is a conclusive understanding of difference in South Korea, but I hope that it gets the conversation started and that people start to really think through local ways of understanding difference so that we can start to deconstruct and pursue a decolonial agenda. So I'm looking forward to seeing how the students have also studied difference and how their future work will also perhaps challenge received wisdom and maybe to even advance a decolonial agenda.
Thank you so much, Doctor. That's fascinating. Particularly as an anthropologist, the idea of anthro-categorism, I believe that was the term. That's really great. I think it's super fruitful. And hopefully those in the audience might follow up with you as far as continuing the conversation. Excellent, thank you. Bieber. Okay, unless there's any misunderstanding, I think Professor Vora, whenever she's ready. If I was muted, possibly.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, I think your internet was cutting out.
Oh, no problem. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, Zoom issues, right? Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Alex, for organizing this and for the students for inviting us to come join your class. So I just want to start by acknowledging that there is a lot going on right now, right? A whole year of remote school, and then the pandemic, and now, India's going through like this huge crisis, all of the violence that our communities have dealt with. So I just want to acknowledge that there's a lot. And I want to start by talking about two particular incidents that have happened in the last couple of weeks, following the kind of conversations that I think we've all been having around what it means to be Asian American, what this new wave of violence means, what racialization means vis-a-vis other groups in the United States. So the first one comes from my college, where I had a conversation with one of my East Asian American colleagues a couple weeks ago, and found out that a letter had gone out, an email had gone out to the AAPI community, asking the community to come together, inviting the community to come together to an open space to discuss anti-Asian violence and racism. And my East Asian American colleague was frustrated by the attendance of that meeting because it turns out they didn't invite any non-East Asian faculty or staff. And so, I asked her to forward me the email. The email was addressed to the AAPI community. Let's not even start with PI because we don't even have, I don't think, Pacific Islander faculty at my tiny college. So I sent an email to our diversity, equity, and inclusion person, just asking them, how are we defining Asian American here? Because last I checked, South Asians are also Asian American, and things that happen to our communities happen to our shared struggles with each other, whether it's happening to East Asians or South Asians. So that's one. Just going to put that one aside. Then I'm going to talk about another one that just happened in the last couple of days, where I'm in my Asian local community group for my town, has an Asian American Facebook group. And somebody had posted an event that was about, it was like a vigil or something like that to acknowledge anti-Asian violence that had been happening. And in the call, it had said something like recent violence against Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, and Sikhs. And what this person had written is, why hasn't anybody acknowledged that there is also violence against Hindus and that Hindus are discriminated against? So I, of course, being the confrontational person that I am, went in there and said, what are you talking about? Tell me like where it is that Hindus are somehow like systematically persecuted in the United States as something that's separate from South Asian racialization. And I got a whole slew of vitriol in response, telling me that I'm a self-loathing brown person and I'm like betraying my people. This was before the person found out that I'm not Hindu. And then once they found out I'm not Hindu, now it's even more proof that I hate Hindus. Okay. So the backstory to this, if people are not familiar with this, is that there has been a push from right-wing Hindu fundamentalist movements, both in India and in the United States, to define this kind of umbrella of things as Hindu phobia, which is designed specifically to create this idea that if you argue against Hindu fundamentalism, you are somehow creating some kind of religious persecution. So I put these two forward just to kind of tell you, like, show you that, we have a lot of internal disagreements. We have a lot of things going on, but they also really highlight a couple of questions to me. The first is, what are our stakes in defining our people as Asian Americans? What does that mean? What is the political project of Asian America? I don't think we've necessarily revisited that question, at least not in an academic sense, in the kinds of conversations that we're having on the ground, everyday people who are not fully embedded inside Asian American studies. A lot of what's happening is this kind of shared sense of understanding of being Asian American based on ethnic similarities, national similarities, religious similarities, which fundamentally collapse into essentialisms. Instead of thinking about our shared histories of racialization, Indians and Chinese have extremely parallel histories in the United States of migration, of racialization, both pre-1965 and post-1965. And if you want to use those categories to kind of think about how brown people are racialized and how East Asian or quote unquote yellow people are racialized in this country and have been racialized in this country, we can see that those are some parallel tracks. There's differences, but there are also parallel tracks. So are we basing our identities as Asian American and our political commitments as Asian American on these shared histories? Are we basing them on commitments to justice for just the groups that we identify with, for a larger group, for all oppressed people? Where do we draw those kinds of lines? The other thing that I want that these two incidents bring up for me is the way that power dynamics and persecutions are transnational, right? We can't think about the Hindu-Muslim conflicts and like the rise of the Hindu right and what is going on in India right now as somehow something that it only happens over there, and not something that we as members of South Asian diasporas, or even people who are engaging the kinds of vocabularies and discourses that come out of South Asian diasporas, we are complicit in particular kinds of discourses and the kinds of power that they wield, right? So there's a responsibility for diasporic people to think about the transnational frameworks that they're engaging and not to be American exceptionalist in the way that they think about their political projects or their identities. And that includes both acknowledging complicity and acknowledging privilege. And then the third thing, and I think this is just what I will say in lieu of a conclusion, is maybe we need to shift the frame and not have it be about who counts, whose experience is central. Let's focus on Asian Americans now, right? And those are important questions, but maybe we should be thinking about how violence against and racism against Asians and Asian Americans is not exceptional. And Dylan Rodriguez, the president of the American Studies Association, recently wrote a really amazing piece about this. It's not exceptional and disconnected from other injustices, right? And so we must be organizing against it as part of a broader commitment. And what is that outward commitment? And what kinds of groups are, if we are committed to a particular kind of liberatory project for Asian Americans, what other groups are we also committed to a liberatory project for? And how are we going to showcase that commitment? And also, what kind of work does that require us to be doing internally, within our own communities, within our own families? And I would love to have this conversation. I mean, this is not a conversation that's one that I have the answers for, right? These are just questions that have been coming up constantly that are swirling around over the last few weeks. And I just kind of wanted to put them out here as a provocation, and hopefully we can have further conversations about them either today or ongoing. And I know a lot of you have probably started already having similar conversations. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Vora, and also the guest speakers for being so great with time. That's really nice of you all. Excellent points. What are the stakes behind defining what we mean by Asian American in Asia? That's been a question we've been having a lot in our own course as far as what are the implications of even trying to define that category. And most importantly, I think with Professor O and Professor Vora's talk it gives us a map of how we might move forward, which I think is really great. So with that, I'm going to move on to the first group. And I think this pairs really nicely with some of the questions, provocative questions that our guest speakers have given us. I hope the students can also provide some other examples and also a student perspective. So we can work with Adele, Annie, and Victor's group. So whenever you're ready, go ahead and share your.
Okay, great. Cool. I'm assuming everyone can hear me. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to our event today. So I'm here with Adele and Victor, and the topic that we're presenting on today is beauty and anti-Blackness in Asia. Next slide, please. So first, to kind of frame our conversation, I'm going to start out by showing everyone this laundry detergent ad that was aired in 2016 in China. All right, next slide, please. So that video kind of demonstrates the complications of how race is perceived currently within an Asian perspective. So some key concepts for our presentation today that we're going to cover, first of all, is racial formation. So racial formation is a complex process that requires pretty careful language when it's being described. The way we're going to talk about it in our presentation today is as a socio-historical process by which racial categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed. We isolate Asia as a unique site of struggle in this ongoing process, not only because of the unique perspectives that it introduces, but also to avoid the black-white binary discussion of race that often frames understandings of race, particularly within Euro-American academia. We're going to approach our presentation today through the question of aesthetics, which is the study of the nature of beauty and taste, which is also why we chose to focus on beauty standards within Asia now. So the graphic that we displayed is a graphic of the US Census and race, which was a detailing of how race was conceptualized within the US Census. So we can see from 1790 to 1850, it was a pretty black and white question. And it was only until later that more categories were added or taken away at certain times, which I think illustrates the concept of how racial formation can be a complex process and how it is a socio-historical process that's ongoing. Next slide, please. So for the context of the presentation today, we refer to the West as understandings within Euro-American academia. It's noteworthy to say that this definition doesn't include diaspora or international migration patterns or indigeneity, which means that we have to be careful to avoid essentializing the divide between the East and West, i.e. assigning particular categories or understandings to the label of East or West, because those understandings are a lot more complicated than we can cover in a 15-minute presentation. Next slide, please. So just to illustrate some of these complications, this is a map of the Chinese and the Indian diaspora that was mapped by The Economist. And this just illustrates how our understandings of Asia and our understandings of the East are actually so much more widespread and complicated than just the territory of Asia itself. Next slide, please. Finally, I'm going to make a note on capitalization and anti-Blackness. So anti-Blackness with a capital B recognizes the unique history of Black people within the United States, which means that this word is only typically used and discussed within the US context. Particularly, this was because things like census data and policy research, such as the Brookings Institute, had made a history of not capitalizing the word of Blackness, which was a request that was forwarded by activists and writers such as W.E.B. Du Bois to capitalize the word Blackness as an acknowledgement of how African Americans and Black people have been historically and systematically discriminated against within US history. Therefore, for the purposes of our presentation, which mostly discusses this understanding in the context of Asia, we will not be capitalizing this word, first of all, to avoid drawing essentializing claims, but also to acknowledge language differences, because as many people know, many Asian languages do not have letters or spellings, which means that like capitalization doesn't become a question. Next slide. This brings us to our main question. How does the process of racial formation inform and construct anti-Blackness in modern Asian beauty standards? And with that, I will hand it to Victor.
Alrighty, thank you very much, Annie. So when we're talking about beauty, whiteness, and anti-Blackness, it all comes down to ancient beauty traditions. For thousands of years in Asia, beauty standards have been tied to whiter or paler complexions. These original concepts were originally born out of class and wealth, a more classist argument, where those with darker complexions tended to be more working class and therefore would have tanner complexions due to working outdoors in the sun, as opposed to those who were wealthy, who did not have to venture outside of their homes most of the time. Eventually, this became a beauty tradition where all sorts of home remedies and techniques would be used in an effort to become paler or appear more wealthy, more powerful in that sense. Nowadays, however, that has evolved into a desire for whiteness that has also fueled and shaped definitions of anti-Blackness in Asia. You can find these in connotations of Blackness in Asian language use, and this is common across many languages. Myself, I am Vietnamese, and I can personally tell you that the way that we use our word for black, Dang, can refer to mystery, to a sense of uncertainty, unknown, to straight up danger sometimes. So there are more negative connotations of the use of the word black and therefore concepts of blackness in Asian language. And also the derision of darker complexions in terms of beauty standards as being undesirable and impure is something that has perpetuated the idealization of whiteness in this case. The picture that you see on screen right here is actually from a textbook for elementary schoolers in India, where it is a textbook of opposites. You see up top, there is a hard and soft regarding a rock and a flower. And then more controversially, of course, beautiful and ugly, depicting a whiter child as beautiful, and then a child with darker skin as ugly. And this is actually very recent. So this depiction still very much is present even to this day. Next slide, please. Now, many in Asia now might argue that these beauty standards are very much outdated and no longer relevant. Asian beauty standards have changed to become more modern and inclusive over time. And while that may be true in some very small baby steps, it still very much is a present problem. The image you actually see here will point to my counter argument. This is an image from a 2013 beauty pageant, a regional beauty pageant, as these contestants competed to go to the national round of Miss Korea at the time. Now, despite it being a very small regional contest, you can kind of see a general sort of trend when it comes to beauty standards, at least in Korea, but this does translate to other nations as well, especially, of course, the much paler complexions than one might expect. Next slide, please. Now, more modern beauty standards in Asia are actually still very much steeped in a desire for whiteness and anti-blackness. Skin whitening still remains one of the most popular cosmetic surgery procedures in all of Asia. It is an industry that totals $30 billion in like estimated value, and skin whitening is at the forefront of that as one of the top 5 procedures in almost every country that we could find statistics for. Skin whitening products and creams are still wildly popular, despite major health risks cited by multiple national health departments, and the WHO, the World Health Organization, actually put out a UN report specifically on sort of skin whitening products and the danger that they have, especially with high concentrations of heavy metals like mercury. But even so, even without beauty products, beauty trends, fashion trends are still very much subtly promoting anti-blackness, especially in regard to tanned skin or even sun-kissed skin. You can especially see this in women's fashion, where there is a very large emphasis on, say, coats, long sleeves, big hats, large sunglasses. It's very, very subtle, and you may not notice it on first or even second glance, but when you start analyzing it, you can see that sort of trend. Next slide. And again, With that sort of value put behind the Asian beauty industry across all sorts of procedures, whether it be cosmetic surgery, beauty products, or purely just fashion, this notion of us having modernized beyond these concepts of a desire for whiteness and anti-Blackness is still very much an unrealistic argument. And with that, I'll hand it off to Adele.
Thank you, Victor. So for this topic, I want to discuss more in depth a sort of ethnic beauty hierarchy that emerges from the trend of skin whitening. The paleness or whitening of skin has been used to establish a sort of beauty hierarchy that places specifically Sino-Thai, Japanese, Chinese, and Korean women at the top. As you can see here from this quote from that Hong Kong woman, concepts of beauty are used to judge women from other Southeast Asian countries and sort of used to judge their desirability in terms of beauty. These discussions usually reference the paleness and coarseness of skin in placing different ethnicities in this sort of ethnic beauty hierarchy. Yet many of Southeast Asians still willingly strive towards achieving pale skin in closeness to paler Asians. This is quite a transnational process as well. For example, if you think about trends such as Korean beauty, those are quite popular among different Asian countries. And trying to appear transnational is also a way to appear cosmopolitan, sophisticated, and modern, which is another reason why these skin whitening products are so popular. Additionally, prizing Asian paleness goes beyond the common example of female skincare. For example, it is evident in partner preference as well. For a specific case, many middle-class gay Thai men prefer East Asian partnerships rather than Caucasian partnerships, as the latter will signal lower class to them. This preference also corresponds to the beauty hierarchy I discussed earlier, since there's a sense of an Asian whiteness being preferred over a Caucasian whiteness. So rather than Asians solely striving towards Western beauty ideals, they're also trying to follow their own constructed beauty hierarchy. Going off the idea that this beauty hierarchy is a construction from Asian culture rather than Western influences, there is the question of if these beauty standards are Eurocentric, since they prize the whiteness of skin. I would argue that the Eurocentric models of whiteness in beauty are sort of just avenues that facilitate the consumerist practice of Asian beauty ideals, rather than being the main influence. So for example, in response to companies such as Johnson & Johnson and Unilever discontinuing certain skin whitening lines or changing product wording, such as changing Fair and Lovely to Glow and Lovely, several Western magazines and publications such as Allure have viewed the situation as sort of a strive towards dismantling colorism, white supremacy, and racism, especially since this happened during the onset of the Black Lives Matter movement. They state that these steps should also work towards dismantling a Eurocentric ideal of beauty, even when referencing products in Asia. And on the other hand, women in Asia responded very differently to the actions of these skincare companies. Many of them criticized the brand for ignoring the preferences of Asian women, who they thought should have rights to buy these products. To them, skin whitening products are not really associated with these issues of colorism and race, but are just part of a personal preference developed through the transnational trends that they've experienced. To them, these preferences should have nothing to do with a Western movement, which views skin whitening as a racial issue within the Black-white binary. Thus, even though skin color and colorism are also embedded in these Western conceptions of race and racism, it is tricky to directly apply the same logic to Asian societies. While skin whitening is certainly still controversial and many Asians do fight against these standards, it seems that forcing change by imposing Western narratives of colorism onto Asian societies may have a lot of obstacles, and such examples of these backlashes may just cause further resistance from Asian women to sort of think about the racial sensitivities that the West is trying to give a spotlight to and make arguments about. That concludes our presentation. So thank you so much for listening, and we'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, group two. That was excellent, talking about the complexities of trying to translate some of these concepts. Moving on to the next group, we have Sarah and Daniel, whenever you're ready.
I'm here. So cool. My name is Sarah.
I'm Daniel.
And so today we're going to be talking about cultural appropriation with respect to fashion in the United States and in Asia. So this is our main question. So how do we qualify the extent of cultural appropriation in the context of Asia? And so we were inspired to think about this question due to the large amount of cultural exchange that's occurring in the world today through fashion, through music, film, and more. And so with this large amount of global exchange, we also see many people growing a fascination with these other cultures and sometimes trying to adopt or borrow various aspects of these cultures that they don't belong to. So in our presentation, we kind of wanted to explore how these aspects of foreign cultures are being used and adopted by individuals who are not from those cultures, and kind of what factors we need to consider when we are examining acts of cultural appropriation. So just as a quick side note, we understand that the labels Western and West are very complicated. And in our presentation, we plan to use an example of cultural appropriation of Asian culture in the US, and also of American culture in Asia. And so therefore, when we say, or when we use the label West, we're specifically referring to the US with regards to the examples used in our presentation. So we're also using the US and American labels in a geographical context. So for example, in one of our examples later on, we're referring to Black culture as an American culture because the inspiration for the music video in that example came from Black hip hop culture in the US.
Okay, cool. And with that in mind, I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on what the main argument of our presentation is. So interestingly, when we actually began preparing this presentation, we first focused on the distinction between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation as two completely separate things. But as we began doing a little bit more and more research into this topic, we actually decided to shift the subject of our presentation away from this binary characterization of cultural appropriation. And we decided to instead identify cultural appropriation as a spectrum because we believe that there are different extents to which culture can be appropriated, and that there are also many different factors that can affect the severity in instances where cultural appropriation is occurring. And so we want to acknowledge that we understand that culture is sometimes very hard to define because it is a term that encompasses a wide variety of traditions, arts, and beliefs, and that also consequently makes the term culture very difficult to generalize. So in order to better frame our argument, we're going to be focusing our discussion of culture by analyzing instances of cultural appropriation through fashion specifically. So the factors that we think are important to analyzing cultural appropriation include power dynamics, intentions, and depth of understanding. And we think that these three factors can be best understood in terms of the following questions. So first, what are the general perspectives and stereotypes that one culture may hold towards another? We think that analyzing the paradigms of particular cultures, and more specifically, how people from a particular culture might feel about other people from other cultures, can be very important in understanding the power dynamics that may exist between people from different cultures. And so in instances of cultural appropriation, the way that people are going to react is going to reflect how they were informed by their own cultural backgrounds And we'll be elaborating on what this looks like with examples in a few minutes. The second question is, does the action in question recognize the significance of the culture that it borrows from? And we think that sometimes this can be a difficult question to answer because when somebody appropriates for another culture, or just when cultural appropriation occurs in general, there isn't always an effective method or a way to determine how well informed the person doing the cultural appropriating is. But nonetheless, we think that this is still a very important question and a very important factor to consider, because when we borrow aspects of another culture, a higher degree of understanding of the meaning of our actions can also make the action more appreciative as opposed to offensive and distasteful. And then the final question concerns whether or not the borrowing of another culture is merely a ripoff of the surface level aesthetics of the culture that it's borrowing from in the context of fashion. And so answering this question is going to give us a better understanding of the intentions behind the people who are doing the appropriating and those who belong to the appropriating culture. And this is, again, important in understanding how appreciative or offensive an action truly is.
Okay. So before we dive into our examples that we're going to use in our presentation, we wanted to quickly discuss a course reading that we felt was relevant to our presentation. So the reading that we chose was Erica Vogel's K-pop in Mexico, Flash Mobs, Media Stunts, and the Momentum of Global Mutual Recognition. So in this article, Erica Vogel describes the presence of the Korean Hallyu wave in Mexico and also explores how Mexican K-pop fans see themselves in relation to the Hallyu wave. She describes many instances in which Mexican K-pop fans show a deep fascination with or even adopting pieces of Korean culture. And so a quote from her article that stood out to us was, some studies argue culture flows more easily from the more to the less powerful countries. South Korea and Mexico, however, have comparable economies ranked 13th and 15th respectively. So kind of using this idea, we wanted to see how the economies of the countries that these different cultures belong to could play a role in the power dynamics, which is one of the factors that we're looking at in our examples. And so we first compared the nominal GDP in current US dollars of several US and Asian countries. And so Investopedia ranked the top economies in the world by GDP using data from the World Bank. So we put together this chart to compare the US and Asian countries that appeared in the first 15 economies. So the US was first on the list with a GDP of 21.43 trillion, China with 14.34 trillion, Japan was third with 5.08 trillion, and then we go to fifth, which was India at 2.87 trillion, and then 12th was South Korea with 1.65 trillion. And so while economic differences between these countries might be a major factor in how we examine the power dynamics between two different cultures, we can also realize that there are socioeconomic differences between ethnic groups within these countries. So especially in the US with our very diverse population. So for example, while the US may have a much larger GDP than South Korea, that doesn't necessarily mean everyone from the US should be considered as a member of a higher power status, because different groups experience different levels of socioeconomic opportunities and inequalities within the US. And so this kind of shows us to how complicated the power dynamics can be to determine in these examples.
Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and transition to the first example of cultural appropriation that we'll be analyzing today. In this example from 2018, Keziah Dom is the person in the middle of this picture that you guys can see on the slideshow right now. And she's wearing a qipao dress, which is typically associated with Chinese culture, to her prom. And her decision to post pictures from the event ended up drawing a lot of controversy online, with many people either choosing to condemn her dress as cultural appropriation, while many others also applauded her dress for being a celebration of Chinese culture. So with that in mind, we'll go ahead and start by taking a deeper look at some of the power dynamics that might be involved in this example. So the reporter Nyan Hu from the Business Insider argues that Keziah Dom's whiteness offers her a position of privilege, which is something that protects her from things like mockery and from scrutiny if she chooses to wear a dress from a different culture. But meanwhile, if an individual of Chinese descent were to wear a qipao, what would happen is it would probably only serve to make that individual seem more foreign. And as Nyan Hu puts it herself, it would be really unthinkable for her, someone with Chinese heritage, to wear the qipao and to assume a praying pose in public the way that the people in the picture are doing on the slide. So to be clear, We aren't necessarily arguing that people who identify as white or people who identify with any sort of position that could be considered privileged, we're not arguing that those people can't engage in cultural exchange. But the general idea that we want to bring to people's minds is that people who come from positions of privilege simply ought to be a little bit more conscious of their position. And that is also something that will depend on their intentions and their depth of understanding, which is something that we'll discuss next in this example. So according to an interview, Dom stated that she simply wanted to wear a nice dress to prom. And so clearly there wasn't really any malicious intent behind the decision to wear the teepal, but perhaps what many people take issue with in this scenario is the fact that her intentions are actually really, really casual because again, she simply wanted to look pretty and she ended up selecting a Chinese dress that just happened to catch her eye. And because it was such a casual decision and because of this perception that people have that the teepal is very culturally significant within the Chinese culture, a lot of people who reacted with outrage probably did so because they interpreted the situation as very disrespectful towards the Chinese culture. This reaction was also exacerbated by the fact that, as you can tell from the picture, they appear to be copying some stereotypical poses, which also seems to be an indication that the decision to wear the Chinese dress was really simply meant to borrow the surface level aesthetics of Chinese culture that we referred to earlier. And this also consequently suggests that even if this picture and this gesture was intended to be appreciative of Chinese culture, it also doesn't feel very meaningful at the same time. So I'll go ahead and discuss some of the impacts of this incident now. So I think one of the big benefits of the debate surrounding Dom's dress was that the general discussion surrounding Asian discrimination was actually brought to the forefront of social media briefly. And this is something that I think is very important because discourse pertaining to racism against Asians is something that often gets swept under the rug. So I view that the increased attention to the issue was definitely a good sign as a result of this incident. Something interesting is that people from China were also actually given the opportunity to participate in this discussion. And according to Chen of the New York Times, there was a lot of positive responses actually from people in China in reaction to Dom's dress, who pointed out that they didn't really believe that there was actually any particular cultural significance or importance to the teepal. And as a result, they didn't really have any issue with foreigners like Dom wearing the dress.
So for our next example, so this is an example of cultural appropriation of American culture in the US. So in this picture, we see J-Hope, who is one of the members of a K-pop group BTS from his Chicken Noodle Soup music video. And so as you can see, his hair is rolled up into gel twists that resemble dreadlocks, which is a hairstyle that is heavily associated with Black identity. So we're kind of going to go through the same factors. So the first one is power dynamics. So we believe that the power dynamics in this example are much more complicated than in the first example. So if we're going back to Vogel's theory, South Korea has a lower GDP than the US. So I guess using the theory of in Vogel's piece, South Korea is the less powerful in this example. But then if we also look at J-Hope and BTS's identity, they are very successful music artists who are well known all over the world with a very extensive fan base. And then the culture they're adopting or borrowing from is a part of the US, which has a much higher economic advantage according to GDPs. But we also know that the members of this culture experience a large racial wealth gap as well as a lot of systematic inequality within the US. So we can't really use the GDP data to determine the power dynamics in this scenario. So if we go next to intentions, so we just through interviews, award speeches, and their work, J-Hope and the entire group BTS have been very vocal about their respect for hip hop. And J-Hope hasn't really made fun of the hairstyle as some K-pop artists have done at their concerts or on TV shows. And this music video was also made as a tribute to the hip hop culture that has inspired him to become the artist that he is today. So while it could be labeled as surface level aesthetics for the music video, it could also be labeled as an intention of respecting the culture that his success has come from. So if we look at the impact of this music video, we see that this example sparked pretty big debates just because BTS is so well known around the world, and this music video was seen by fans from all over. And so we also see that BTS fans either jumped to J-Hope's defense and others turned against him. So for example, one comment said, quote, "I don't think you understand how revolutionary it is that Chicken Noodle Soup, a Harlem-based song, was paid homage by Becky G and J-Hope with Korean and Spanish lyrics. intertwined within it, and the music video filled with people of color, end quote. But then on the flip side, we also see another comment that said, quote, I don't care if it's gelled, it's still appropriating Black hairstyle. It's styled to look like African styled hair on a recreation of a Black song, end quote. And then also this example shows that we kind of need to take personal bias into account as well when we're examining these examples. So we realize that it's very difficult to tell how much of these people's opinions are based on their opinions and love for BTS. And so one comment said, quote, we can't just shut up just because it's Hobie, which is his one of his nicknames. He needs to be aware, educated, and held responsible for his actions regardless. J-Hope is no different from the other idols who do cultural appropriation, so don't let any biased love control your feelings, end quote.
So throughout this presentation, we've really talked a lot about the importance of positions and perspectives in terms of how that might impact cultural appropriation. And so we think that it would also be very important for us to address our own position in relation to this topic. So as Asian Americans who both identify with cultures that are often appropriated within the US and in the West, as we referred to it earlier, we are definitely inclined to take a bit more of a critical stance in our analysis. And so to address this counter argument, we want to acknowledge that people do have different perspectives, and sort of the objective of our presentation was to inform that perspective by describing some of the factors that we believe should be taken into consideration when defining the extent of cultural appropriation. And we do want to share our perspectives, but at the same time, we aren't necessarily aiming to change people's opinions. We just want to articulate our own criticisms on the examples of cultural appropriation that we analyze to get people thinking about the issues. So that was definitely a lot of information to take in our presentation, but we hope that we definitely effectively showed that the borrowing of other cultures is a very nuanced subject. We're both very grateful that we had the chance to share our thoughts on cultural appropriation, because in a world that is becoming more global, cultural appropriation is also simultaneously becoming more and more relevant as it happens more frequently. And we think it's important to recognize that cultural appropriation is something that does have real consequences. So at the end of the day, we'd like to argue that cross-cultural exchange is something that has the potential to be very beneficial, and we want people to be able to enjoy those benefits in a very responsible and respectful way. And so with that in mind, that just about wraps up our presentation. We're both very happy to answer questions later on during the Q&A.
All righty, thank you so much, Sarah and Daniel. Really, really great. In the interest of time, let's move on to the last group, which is Sarah, Peter, and Jiwon.
Good afternoon, guys. Thank you so much for joining us. Today I am with Sarah and Jiwon, and we are presenting on racial solidarity in the social justice movement. So we were inspired to present on this subject because of the expressions of solidarity that we saw during the BLM protest, as well as the Stop AAPI movement. We saw individuals, politicians, and organizations, as well as companies, share statements and pledged actions in light of these events. In our presentation today, we aim to explore what solidarity means and how it can be employed to strengthen our collective resolve towards racial justice. So our main question today is, what is racial solidarity and how does it mutually benefit all racial communities?
So today we will present on why racial solidarity cannot simply be based off of shared experiences, because the need for commonality can cause erasure in terms of the systemic privileges and oppression that exist among different people of color. We like to preface our presentation with the basis of understandings of race through racial formation, through the racial formation theory, which is the process by which social, economic, and political forces determine the content and importance of racial categories, and by which they are in turn shaped by racial meanings. This theory emphasizes the fluidity and pervasiveness of constructs of race within the US. Moreover, race has been institutionalized to systemically oppress non-white groups and is influential in shaping both individual one-on-one and group interactions through prejudice and stereotypes. We also like to introduce this concept of people of color blindness by Jared Sexton. In his book, People of Color Blindness, Notes on the Afterlife of Slavery. And this really just pinpoints the refusal to admit structural differences and positions. And it can be summarized as the assumption or insistence upon a monolithic character of victimization under white supremacy. White supremacy is a word thrown around pretty often, but in this presentation, we like to refer to the racial hierarchy in which race is a spectrum in which white people are most dominant and Black people are disadvantaged. We acknowledge that quote unquote white and quote unquote Black are social constructs as well. And this racial, I guess, structure encompasses both social privilege and disadvantage afforded to individuals belonging to different racial categories. Additionally, we categorize those identifying as Asian, Asian American, and Pacific Islander broadly in the AAPI community, which stands for Asian American Pacific Islander community. And we want to refer to the xenophobia towards this community as Asian hate, because this term is most used in media, so we won't use the term like anti-AAPI. When we discuss solidarity, we first invoke a case study, and then we uncover the history of solidarity in the US and introduce some challenges to solidarity.
So in their paper, Big Solidarity, Theorizing Empathy in Social Justice Movements, Roseanne Liu and Savannah Shang emphasize limitations of solidarity through shared experience. So in the paper, Liu draws from her conversations with her mother on Jim Crow laws and redlining. And the quote on the left is talking about how her mother equates African slavery and indentured Chinese labor. So to quote from directly, her mother says, you said that Black people were treated badly. Well, they did the same thing to Chinese people. They, in this case, were white Americans, British, and Spanish colonialists. And the same thing referenced indentured Chinese laborers who, through subterfuge and kidnapping, were sent to work on plantations in the 19th century. You and your brother should only care about helping Black people, she nishes. Caught off guard, I retort, well, if they did the same thing, Chinese people, shouldn't you care more? I mean, that was bad, but it's not the same. And that's the end of the quote, but despite historical connections and perceived similarities between slavery and indentured labor, asserting that they are the same simply erases like basic facts about the scale and the scope of these events. And the authors conclude to provide an alternative that is what they refer to as thick solidarity. And this definition is really at the core of our argument, which is that this solidarity is defined as one based on a radical belief in the inherent value of each other's lives, despite never being able to fully understand or fully share in the experiences of those lives. Essentially saying that our solidarity should not be based in shared experience, because that's ultimately what we simply don't have those shared experiences to base our solidarity off of.
One such example of a movement of solidarity was the Rainbow Coalition of Revolutionary Solidarity. So during the 1960s, about 40,000 Southern migrants came to Chicago seeking work and an escape from poverty. However, at the same time, Chicago was characterized by corruption, gang violence, and police harassment. And these conditions were already all too familiar with the people of color who already lived in the city. They faced redlining enforced by white gangs, were denied resources like education, city jobs, and home ownership, and were often restricted from accessing public spaces. Fed up with these conditions, both social and economic, the Rainbow Coalition was started when the leaders of the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, and the Southern migrants and the Young Patriots met up and collaborated. Together, they fought for better economic and working conditions for all and fought police brutality, corruption, gentrification, and institutional and structural racism in Chicago. Although this coalition was relatively short-lived, it symbolized how a shared commitment towards justice can mobilize different groups together and can empower all people.
So now I'm gonna talk a little bit about some like the barriers, like difficulties in racial solidarity. The first being the story about a woman in Houston, you probably heard of it. And we don't want to pretend that like solidarity is easily accomplished and that there's like not like hatred that's inherent to it, between like racial groups in the US. So in line with kind of the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes over the past year, in mid-April, 2 Black women were charged with a hate crime after assaulting a Korean store owner here in Houston. And the store owner was okay, but the story shows that there's like very real consequences to like a racial divide that is rooted in white supremacy. So in addition to like harshly condoning anti-Asian hate and doing everything we can to prevent attacks like these in the future, we should also consider this tech in the context of racial solidarity. So like, so often you see stories like this being used as kind of ammunition against, say, like the Black Lives Matter movement and racial solidarity. But when you zoom out and consider these stories in a broader historical context, race-based violence between racial groups is rooted in white supremacy, and that to reach the power that white Americans have, now white racial groups feel that they can only reach the top at the expense of other racial groups. And we should be able to hold these people who committed this crime accountable while acknowledging that both the store owner and the attackers are a victim of a racial hierarchy at which white Americans are placed at the top. And so one of the arguments kind of against solidarity or kind of creating like a coalition is that solidarity among minority groups may alienate a white supremacist power structure, ultimately making change more difficult. And this is like a legitimate concern, like as we've seen throughout like kind of America's most recent reckoning with race. When people in power face resistance, they're not going to be as willing to give up that power. And like we want to be able to say that there's some way to support racial equity without being met with like personal and structural resistance. But in a sense that alienation is kind of a symptom of the problem itself. White Americans, especially white men, have been able to avoid identity politics for so long because race has always been something that other people have. And a shrinking group, either in terms of power or in population, cannot avoid being reminded that they are a group. And so this sense of alienation is kind of inherent to the problem. And so there's no way to avoid this alienation and resistance towards threats to white supremacist power structures. But in this sense, alienation should be scrutinized and also considered a difficult but kind of reassuring sign that there is progress. So speaking of progress, we also want to recognize like that engaging in racial solidarity is amorphous and difficult on an individual level. But there's still stuff we can do. There's so many great organizations that we want to like highlight a few that are doing really great work in the Houston area, and they all provide opportunities for event participation and volunteering and education and donations. First is the OCA of Houston, and they advocate for social, political, and economic well-being of Asian and Pacific Americans. They have lots of events, lots of classes. So for example, like one that's coming up is like a bystander intervention training in which like you get to learn how to help people targeted by identity-based bigotry and harassment. Another one that's like one of my personal favorites that I really like is the Project Row Houses. And the Project Row Houses are a series of small structures, like houses that take about 5 blocks, and they serve as venues for art in Third Ward that occupy like a significant footprint in Houston's historic Third Ward, one of like the Houston's oldest Black neighborhoods. And last is the Texas ACLU. Y'all have probably heard of it. They work through the courts, legislature, and through public education to protect civil rights and individual liberty. So their issue areas range from LGBT issues, criminal justice, voting rights. And I've gotten to work with them, and they're really great people, and you can do really amazing work with them. There's tons of opportunities there. I didn't even listen because there's so many. And last, we want to acknowledge that there's like inherent value in having difficult conversations about race, and it's easy kind of to get caught up in the divisiveness of conversation and how difficult the conversation is. But talking about it is still a sign of moving forward. self-reflection on like one's own positionality and advocacy interacts with and how it interacts with outside racial groups is important. In other words, like willingness to have conversations about racial hostility and advocacy is an important thing we can do to move forward. And so on that note, that's all we have to say. Thank you everyone for listening. And also thank you to Dr. Lee for his support over the past semester.
Okay, great. And thank you everyone to all the students. It's been great. Everyone's really good with time. We have about 10 minutes or so. At the very end, I'm gonna throw it back to Ms. Capro, who has a last minute announcement for the Asia Society. We have several questions in the chat box. I'll go ahead and read them real quickly. There's about 4. I think 2 are directed toward the beauty presentation. Someone asked, a lot of the talk was on women's preferences. I think the question was, do men prefer whiteness as well? And then related to that, we have another question here in terms of beauty standards in Asia. What are some of the first steps that you think should be taken to move away from holding that anti-Blackness ideal? And then there's another question regarding BTS on the hand signs that the boys are doing. And any of the groups are able to respond, including just the last one. I think the presentation was fantastic as far as pushing the conversation forward, or even Professor Vora, who I believe is still on, if she has any thoughts. All right, while folks are thinking, I guess I will ask then, this is a question I think that's interesting. How about the one on the beauty standards? Can that group, I believe it was group 2, maybe 1, my brain's not working right now, but the one as far as the men, any thoughts on the men, Asian men who might have particular racialized ideas of desirability and whatnot?
Sure, like we can answer the questions about. So I guess like regarding I think Victor mentioned that like beauty standards in Asia have close ties to class in addition to like race. And I think that class overall refers to like whatever gender identity you might identify as. So that would be men, women, like non-binary folks, or like whatever identity. I think that class implicates what is people in Asia find aesthetically pleasing, which means that like whiteness or an ideal towards a particular kind of whiteness, as Adele was talking about, more or less permeates throughout like the population, regardless of like what your gender identity is. And I guess for the other question about like steps that can be taken, like Victor and Del, feel free to like hop in on this as well. I guess my thought on that is like, as Adele mentioned, it's very complicated process. So there's like no one way to resolve this issue. And something that we have to be careful about is like forcing Western understandings of like a narrative of like a Black-white binary onto Asian women, because as we can see in our presentation, this has already caused backlash, which means that like in order for us to devise a solution, this is going to require a lot of groundwork of like actual conversation with like people in Asia to like not only understand how race and aesthetics is perceived from their perspective, but also like an understanding of like it's going to take a lot more like close work than just being like, hey, it's bad to be anti-Black, because that's not necessarily how people there perceive of it.
Excellent response, Annie. I'll leave it open still for any other questions, or if any group wants to respond to the ones I presented.
So thank you for bringing up the question about the hand signs about the prom group picture. I think it's really interesting that you brought this up, and I realize now that I forgot to mention the peace signs that were being held up in the back of the picture. So I think I only mentioned the prayer poses, but the reaction to this picture in general, I think also did include reactions to some of the prayer poses, because what I mentioned about the prayers that were being done in the front row of the picture is that a lot of people sort of interpret it as like a stereotypical Asian pose. And I think there was a very similar reaction to the idea of the peace signs. So because a lot of people had that interpretation, I think that also did contribute to some of the backlash towards the pictures online. And to some extent, I'd say that I also hold that same perspective. I think it is kind of a stereotypical Asian pose to some extent. And I think it may be a little bit more subtle than what the ladies are doing in the front row, but I think it's really glad, I'm really glad that you brought that up and gave me a chance to reiterate what I meant earlier when I was talking about that. So thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for that response. I think most of the questions I've covered in the chat box, unless anyone else has any new ones.
I would like to address one that was answered briefly about the picture of the beauty pageant contestants in our presentation. Sorry, I can't turn on my video right now for some reason. The question was, thank you very much. The question was about whether or not the picture of the beauty pageant contestants was photoshopped. Yes, there was a claim put out that the picture that was used in various news articles to point out this trend was photoshopped. And I personally thought that even despite photoshopping, I think that actually will actually makes it just as relevant, if not more so, because if the pictures are photoshopped, that means that they were photoshopped to sort of create or to achieve a sort of ideal image in terms of beauty standards, which only serves to demonstrate that continued desire towards whiteness in terms of beauty standards, as well as a sort of anti-Black, anti-tan, anti-dark complexion in Asian beauty pageants.
Great, we have really responsive group members. Perfect, thank you, Victor. Unless there's any other questions, I can leave it also to Professor Vora if she'd like to make any final comments. Otherwise, I guess we can wait a little bit longer if there's any other questions. There is one comment here. This is actually from a guest lecture we've had. So thank you, Professor Gordon Chang. He writes, in Chinese history, I think the idea of quote unquote white supremacy has roots from the agricultural era. So that's an interesting historical perspective. Thank you for that. Peasants working under the sun. Yes, I think that group articulated some of that kind of cross-cultural phenomena. Thank you.
Dr. Lee, there are a few more comments in the Q&A
Sure.
box.
Okay, I think I'm reading it. Here's another one. For the group on cultural appropriation, the character of Mei from Overwatch has a new MMA skin in which she has box braids. Using your methods of examination, what is your take? Many people defended the skin because other fighters use the hair, but even then they are also engaging with or crossing the line. There's many hairstyles to protect women fighters. Many people now call cornrows boxer braids due to industry adoption. So if you could make this a quick answer, please.
So thank you for bringing up this question. I actually have a very vague idea what you're talking about. And my understanding on the situation is that, oh, should I start my video? Yeah, I'll go ahead and click that. Okay, perfect. So yeah, like I was saying, I think I know what you're talking about with the whole Overwatch skin or whatever. And my understanding is that, like you said, it's actually, I think there is some sort of practical element to arranging your hair in that sort of sense. And I think a lot of people who had a criticism had this interpretation that it was sort of like culturally appropriating Black culture. But again, I think a lot of people who defended it claim that it was just for practical reasons. So yeah, I think what you've put out is just, or what you stated is, I'm glad that you brought it up because I think it does have relevance to our presentation. And yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'm going to pose one question before I move back to Ms. Copperell for the last group, actually. This being our last class, end of the semester. I love your topic. I'm kind of curious if anyone in your group would like to respond, particularly with rice, my understanding being that it's known for being this racially inclusive, racially diverse campus in comparison to many other elite universities in the US. So what do you think is the future of your generation with this question, this very relevant but very difficult question you're asking about racial solidarity? Just on a personal level, do you see this happening on campus? Are you optimistic it is as nuanced as you're presenting it with your generation?
I think, like, personally, like, I feel pretty optimistic, but there's also like a thing about Rice specifically that I think that we pride ourselves so much on like kind of diversity that it lets us off a little bit, being like, oh, we don't have to think about this. We're already doing so well. Like, we must be doing so much better than like most places. And I think I would like, I guess, warn against that, if anything. And very similar to like the happiest students. Like, that's with another thing we're known for, is like allowing us to kind of assume that we're doing great and that not pushing us to go further. But I think especially, like, I've seen a lot of like activism on campus. And, like, I think I'm really, like, I'm proud of what we've done like as students in the past, year. But yeah, I feel optimistic, but I think we should remain critical.
All right, well, on that note, I'm very optimistic too. You all did a fabulous job. I'm going to push it to Ms. Capro, who had one last message, I think, before I close.
Yes, thank you. And I think that was a great note to end on here too. Hearing all of your work and your presentations, definitely I think it inspires optimism for the future of youth, be involved with these issues and engaging. So thank you for that. We have a survey in the chat for you to fill out if you could give us some feedback on the program as well. I think she enjoyed the presentations as well. Yes. And so please do take the survey. And us at Asia Society, we have over 150 programs a year focused on building cross-cultural understanding. So please check us out. We have a whole list of programs for May as well. So we hope to see you again at some of our future programs. Thank you.
Thank you. And if you have any questions again for the guest presenters, please feel free to refer to this. I believe they'll be on a recording through the Asia Society YouTube page, or myself, and I could relay it to the students. I would like to just personally give a round of applause to the students for their talk and an excellent semester, and the guest speakers. Thank you, Circle. Thank you, Asia Society. Thank you, Chao Center for Asian Studies. Thank you very much.